Hi folks, and welcome to this edition of the Leadership Insight series where we're having a chat about business ethics with an expert on this topic, Dennis Gentilin. How are you, Dennis?
I'm very well, Gary, and thanks for arranging this.
Very, very happy to have you on board, and I really appreciate you on board with us today. And we are going to have a bit of fun with you and a whole lot of learning, hopefully, as we go through today's session. So let's set a little bit of background here, just in case people aren't aware. I'm Gary Ryan from Organisations That Matter, and I help talented professionals, such as everyone in our audience today, move beyond being good. So I do that through executive coaching, team development programs, high performance culture development, and I have the pleasure to do a fair bit of work in the tertiary sector and do a fair bit of student development work in that space too. So it's a pleasure to have all of you on board with us today. But enough about me, let's get on to the focus of our topic. Dennis, there were some headlines going back into late 2003 and into 2004 which were telling the story about some unethical behaviour that was occurring at the National Australia Bank at the time. Can you just give us some of the highlights behind your experience, please?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So, obviously that experience was the catalyst for the book. So essentially I joined an FX, a foreign exchange trading desk as a graduate off the graduate program at the National Australia Bank. And they became involved in conduct that eventually became found to be illegal, but initially it was one of those circumstances, Gary, where they were operating in the grey area, and essentially it began where the business was what they call smoothing the profit and loss, and they were trying to reduce the volatility in the numbers, a practice which believe it or not, is not that uncommon, but it's obviously once you take that first step, you're on the slippery slope, and it eventually ended up where total losses amounted to around, I think it was $360 million was the final amount, and it resulted in obviously a lot of publicity, a lot of reputational damage, significant fall in the share price, loss of jobs at multiple levels. I think even the chairman and the CEO resigned, and the NAB embarked on a huge, an extended period of renewal after the incident.
And one of the things that people are interested in is that, as you just mentioned, Dennis, you were you'd recently completed the grad program, obviously having finished your studies at Monash University, and then you find yourself in this situation where you're in this team where you're noticing some behaviours that aren't appropriate, and James is, in particular, is interested about how did you even get started on your journey of taking some action?
It's a good question, and they're very, very difficult environments to navigate, Gary, at the best of times, and least of which, when you're a young graduate. And ultimately what you find, especially when you're a young graduate, you really, well, I personally, and I think most graduates are in the same boat, I hadn't really gone through the process of thinking about what was important to me and what my personal values were. And what tends to happen, you enter workforces, being fairly enthusiastic, very bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and you let the workplace and, more importantly, the senior people that you look up to dictate, to you what your values are and what's important. And I was, one of those unlucky people that landed in an environment where, my mentors and my senior leaders, who I really looked up to and admired as role models, weren't displaying the most ethical behaviours. And it was quite a, difficult environment, Gary. It was, very, lots of immoral behaviour, lots of norms that were inappropriate. I did have a go at challenging, one of the senior leaders, and was told in no uncertain terms that that's not what you do around here. And so the way that I coped with it, and I talk about this in my book, I don't suggest this is the right way. If anything, it's probably the worst way I can go about it. But the way that I coped with it was to try and distance myself from the poor behaviour and turn a blind eye to it as much as I could. And I felt that was the only way I could, stay true to do my values.
So what's interesting, and Adnan asked this question, he says that, despite being stopped, if you like, from your mentor and senior leaders when you did challenge the behaviour, there must have been some factors that you considered that really pushed you to decide to let people know of the unethical behaviour that you were witnessing. So how did you go about doing that part, Dennis?
Yeah, so when I reflect, Gary, I actually consider myself to be really fortunate. So, like I said, I went for an extended period of time where the way that I tried to deal with it was by distancing myself from it as much as possible. And then I had a pretty heated exchange with one of the senior traders when I was based in London, and he told me the extent of the issues and the losses that were being carried. And at that point, Gary, I actually didn't know what to do with that information, and I actually thought to myself, the way that I'll deal with this is to just resign and walk away from it, and it's not my problem. And it may seem crazy now, but that to me was an actual real live option for me that I seriously considered. And I remember going home to my wife, and I'd been very open to her throughout the whole process, so she knew how I felt and what was going on, and she implored me to do something about it. She even rallied the support of our neighbours in London, and they actually came around, I remember that night quite clearly, and said, you've got to do something. And the problem I faced, Gary, I just didn't know who to go to and what to do, given I'd already made a previous attempt.
Yes.
And I was very fortunate where I went into the office the next day, and there was a man sitting next to me who wasn't on my desk but happened to be sitting next to me, came out from Australia roughly the same time as me, and he sensed that I was struggling with things, and he took it upon himself in the previous few months to act as a bit of a mentor to me. And it was the first time I opened up to someone outside our business, and I remember quite clearly saying to him at the end of the day, there's stuff going on and I don't know what to do, I really don't know what to do. And he just looked at me and he said, Dennis, if you went into the system, could you find it? And I said, well, look, I probably could. And he just said, you've got no choice. Yes. And it was the end of the day, he picked up his jacket and he just walked out and just left me with those words.
Mm.
And it was just one of those very powerful moments where, prior to that I was uncertain, there was lots of fog, and, I just didn't know what to do. And after that, it was just absolute clarity, and I almost went into autopilot. And he just, in a very powerful way, reconnected me with my moral obligations. And when people say, what do you mean he walked out? And, he walked out, I think, because that was his way of saying to me, Dennis, you've got to step up here. And when I walked out of the office that night, he was actually waiting for me downstairs. And, he was a guy that actually gave me the courage to go forward again and do what I needed to do. And I knew that if the response I got wasn't what was deserved, that he would help me find a way to make sure the issues saw the light of day.
So I suppose in particular answering James and Adnan's questions is having that critical ally. Now you described you had the ally obviously with your wife and close friends outside of work, but this was probably the first time you found an ally really inside the business who was prepared to stand with you and encouraged you to continue to take the action. And obviously for them, what you then went and discovered later on. Now, we won't go into the details here, but what people need to understand is that you spent significant period of time in court when the proceedings got that far, and it's probably fair to say, Dennis, isn't it, that the defence teams were working pretty hard to tear through your character, etc., to sort of lighten the case against the people they were defending. And people need to understand that that's the level that it got to, that you found yourself in that situation. And who would have imagined when you heard those words, you have no choice, that's exactly where you were going to end up. And no doubt between that point and ending up in as one of the witnesses, obviously in the court cases, there was a lot of moments in between there where you had to continue to step up. Is that fairly accurate?
Yeah, you're spot on, Gary, on a lot of fronts there. I mean, firstly, your point about finding an ally. Some of the advice I give young people especially is, firstly, like I said, really think about what your values are and what you stand for, and what what are the things that you are prepared to not negotiate away. But secondly, I talk about this concept of a council of advisors. Have good people around you that you can go to, not just for ethical issues, but whenever you've got to make big decisions in life, because they really help you reconnect, to what's important. But then also, yeah, you're right, Gary. I mean, going to court, that's the job of defence lawyers. They have to tarnish the reputation of the witnesses that are representing the prosecution. And, like I say, I don't present myself, Gary, as a white knight, as, one of these whistleblowers who came along and never saw anything and then put their hand up as soon as I saw something wrong. There was clear evidence that I knew that there was wrongdoing going on for some time. And so they tried to, make me look just, as guilty as the, client that they were representing. And it's funny that when you make that point, that when I was told I have no choice, it never really crossed my mind at that point what the consequences could be. Like I said, I went into autopilot. I never thought, Dennis, do you know you're a whistleblower here, or do you know this could go to court? I just actually did what I thought I had to do. So yeah, it was quite a journey, to say the least.
It's interesting that you said at the start, and you say this in the book as well, that you weren't clear as a graduate employee of what your personal values were, and yet they were clearly deep down inside you, and there was something nudging them, even though you might have not been able to articulate them, that something was wrong, and you kept feeling that. And then when you got that clear evidence with what you were seeing when you went into the system, that there really was an affront to your personal values, and you do describe some of the characteristics that you learnt from your father and your mother growing up, and obviously these were affronted by what you saw, and that gave you the courage and the strength, I suppose, to stand up and to take some action. And Ali's interested to know in terms of, we've sort of already talked about the point where you'd seen enough, but along that journey, I mean, you've just said you sort of went into autopilot, but did you have any further struggles along the journey, or was it just more, once I've made this call, off I go?
Yeah, it was pretty much the latter, Gary. I'm not suggesting it was easy. It was really hard. There were internal investigations. There was PwC came in and did an investigation. I had to appear and a recorded interview with ASIC for half a day. Really, really trying. But you sort of put yourself on a path. It's almost like you draw a line in the sand, Gary, and you say to yourself, I'm not going back. And that's how I felt.
And as a follow-up question, Ali says, what did you learn about yourself that you were unaware of throughout this process?
That's a really good question, actually. I learned a lot, and obviously a lot of it's in the book, but one of the things I learned is how susceptible we all are, Gary. So I talk about this in my book. I was brought up in a household where living your life for a good sound moral virtues was really important, and my dad especially was had extraordinary values and really demonstrated how you live by them. But despite that, I found myself in an environment where there was lots of poor conduct and where unethical behaviour was normalised, and I too allowed my standards and principles to slip markedly. And it just makes you realise, probably one of the key lessons for me is how susceptible you are and how important it is to reflect, always reflect about what your values are and how are you going and living by them.
I think that's, we'll get there pretty soon, but, your experience took you on this journey of trying to answer this question, how do so-called good people end up behaving unethically? And as you've just answered the question from Ali about your personal insight was, I'm just as susceptible to anybody, and maybe even the notion of good people and bad people is not necessarily appropriate for this this topic, because really a lot of the things that you discovered were quite significant in terms of everyone's vulnerability, including myself. And that was one of the things that really jumped out to me, Dennis, in reading through your book is, what, all of us are so susceptible given the systemic pressures and the research that you've gone and done. And by the way, folks, if you haven't had a look at the book yet, I really encourage you to do it, because everything Dennis says is 100% backed up by research, and not just one piece of research. There's multiple research behind every piece of the step that he's gone away. In fact, prior to today's session starting, I mentioned to Dennis it's as if he's done the literature review on business ethics and what the systemic forces and personal forces are that really cause people to struggle, and which has resulted obviously in your authoring your book, The Origins of Ethical Failures, Lessons for Leaders. And both Chen Wen and Catherine and Parby, so we've got three of our participants today, Dennis, are really interested in what your advice for graduates might be. So graduate students going into the workplace, what would be your, so you've already mentioned one thing, which is your council of advisors. Have you got any other specific advice for them?
Yeah, it's like I said, I mentioned it before. Yeah, surrounding yourself by a good council of advisors is important, but also really thinking about what's important to you, and then being aware of the systemic pressures that you're all going to face. So, you know, I was talking to a guy the other day who said he was speaking to a partner of a law firm, and you know, like most people, we think that the partners of law firms are very ethical people, and this guy no doubt is. But you know, we're talking about, and it was what you and I mentioned, Gary, before we came on this webinar, about the difference between personal integrity and system integrity. And this lawyer who runs this law firm, you know, obviously we like to think, and I'm sure he does, has a lot of personal integrity, but he presides over a system, and what that system requires young people to do, so, you know, graduates joining that law firm, is to clock a certain number of hours. And if you look at the number of hours they're expected to clock, you know, once you take away time for sleep and meal times and et cetera, you know, they're left under no choice but to either work themselves to the ground or cheat. And lo and behold, you know, young lawyers do both. There's countless examples of young lawyers that are overworked and countless examples of young lawyers that fudge numbers in order to clock the necessary hours. Now, these young lawyers are not bad people, Gary, but they're operating in a system that requires them to behave in a certain way. And that's, you know, what I try to say to young graduates, you know, make sure you're aware of what's important to you and what your values are and where you draw the line, and understand how the environment in which you're entering any workplace will cause you to behave in ways which you may, you know, may be very uncharacteristic, and you may have thought were not possible prior to entering that workplace.
And what's interesting is your evidence that you've gone and discovered, Dennis, highlights how you talk about the slippery slope and how these things that you mentioned, even with the NAB FX Trading scandal, that it started off as a grey area. And then at a point in time, it moved from being a grey area to actually illegal behaviour. But exactly where that point was it just sort of happened because they were on this slippery slope of going from grey area to not grey anymore, but not realising it. And because it's become the way things are around here, it's become the culture, it just goes on and on and on. And as you sort of highlight through your book, the slippery slope becomes an exponential slippery slope. And certainly was the case with the numbers that you were talking through there. So Ellie's got another follow-up question. She says, you know, where are the good role models in society? Culture seems to dictate that the good guys end up last. Even our political leaders are dubious in their ethics, broken promises, lies, etc. Who can students really turn to as the good role models? Powerful question.
That's a very good question. You know, I think you can find role models if you look hard enough, and you don't necessarily have to look to, you know, the leaders, you know, in society for your role models. But I also wouldn't underestimate the role that young people can play as role models. And one thing, you know, Gary, that we fail to recognise whenever we're trying to drive change through any system, you know, we always look to the leaders to actually do that. But we fail to recognise the power we have as individuals, even by just our little actions and our little, you know, the decisions we make personally, how that can actually help in driving a system in the right direction. I love the words of Barack Obama recently, where they were asking him about, you know, how gay marriage was legalised in the States and people were giving him credit for it. And he said, well, actually, no, it wasn't me. There's been people trying to push the system in that direction for years and years and years. I just happened to be the guy that was president when it happened.
Yes.
And that goes for any system, no matter how small, from a local sporting club to a large organisation to an entire country. Don't underestimate the role, regardless of where you sit in that system, that you can play in helping, push that system in the right direction.
Yes, and along those lines is, and this sort of goes back to the good versus bad people. Rob's interested to know that given what we now know about the origins of ethical failures, what are the merits and how would the outcomes be of developing new and or aligning existing psychometric screening tools? So screening for ethical goodness or ethical badness. What's your research that you've uncovered? Tell us in relation to that question.
Yeah, so I've got a strong view on psychometric tests, Gary, and don't get me wrong, there are psychopaths out there. They're a very small minority of the population. I think the statistics are 1 or 2%, if that. And by all means, if you can screen them, you don't want them in your workplace. I get that. I sort of put people in 3 groups. You've got the ones that and actually Mary Gentile, who's an academic in the States, uses these terms to describe them. She calls them the opportunists, and the opportunists are the people who will take make the most of any situation and potentially behave in an unethical way in order to serve their own means. At the other end, you've got your idealists, and the idealists are the ones that will always do the right thing regardless of what situation you put them in. And once again, they're in the minority. And in the middle, you've got a big group of people that she calls the pragmatists. And they're people that, they're not bad people, but if you put them in a certain situation where there's pressures in that system to behave in certain ways, and they potentially will compromise their principles and their standards and behave in unethical ways. And so my only concern with psychometric testing is I don't think there is a test where you can, show that someone's going to behave in an unethical way, because, an environment will test even the best person. Like I often say this to people, if you think you never behave in an immoral way, where you haven't been placed in a situation where your morality has been sufficiently tested. Yeah. Although I don't discount the need for psychometric testing. I think it's necessary that we test people when they come into an organisation. We definitely want to weed out people that are going to be bad news. Never underestimate the power of the situation and how, someone filling out a paper and pencil form will not necessarily determine how they will behave when they're under pressure, their boss is asking them to do something which is unethical, and, there appears to be no way out.
And you've uncovered study after study that reinforces that fact, and the fact that people significantly overestimate how they will actually behave in a circumstance compared to what their actual behaviour is. So their theory about how they will behave versus their actual behaviour when put into moral dilemmas is, from the research at least, shows there's a big gap.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a classic one there where I like the study where this young lady is applying for a role as a research assistant at a lab, and she's been interviewed by a male who's in his early 30s, and she gets asked 3 inappropriate questions. And I can't remember what the questions were, but it was something like, do you wear a bra to work, or do you have a boyfriend?
Yes,
and they're really inappropriate questions. And they ask ladies, in their early 20s, if you were asked these questions in an interview, what would you do? And, the majority of them said, I wouldn't answer them, and I'd ask them why are they important. But when they actually put ladies in that situation, so a separate group of ladies in that situation, hardly any of them challenged the interviewer, and the ones that did, I think it was 30-odd% that did so at the end, and, did in a sort of a meek and mild way. So like I said, you just can't underestimate the power of the situation.
And actually, Ellie's just shared with us that Dr. Ross Donohue at Monash University is doing some interesting research right at this moment on how to weed out the psychopathic ones from leadership positions. So I'd be interested to find out a little bit more about that research that's going on in the background as we speak. Now, Dennis, I'm really interested for us to get into the solution mode in the time that we've got remaining. So what is it, and certainly Tanya is very interested to know, what can we do to dissuade people from behaving unethically? And I suppose there's 4 key areas that you've mentioned that people can focus on. And you like?
Yes. Do you want to go through them one by one, Gary, or?
Yes, yeah, we'll go through them one by one. So probably about what you've learned, and then what this then tells us about what we can do to actually enhance the chances of behaving ethically.
Yeah, so, and this comes back to what we were saying, context shapes character, comes back to what we're saying, how the situation, can dictate how people behave. And so, I think the best thing organisations can do, instead of, trying to weed out the good or the bad people, is try and create environments that promote the right conduct. Now, banking and finance is, obviously the classic example where, what I say about that industry is it lost sight of its core purpose, because ultimately the purpose of a financial institution is to serve customer and community, to provide a service and do it in a commercially viable way. But what happened over time, especially leading up to the GFC, is banks, and especially the people within them, became very self-serving. So they lost sight of their social obligation and, and their, like I said, their purpose and their need to contribute to customer and community, and they became very self-serving, and people joined the industry to make as much money for themselves, to the detriment of others. And once you start creating environments where people become very, self-serving and self-centered and do whatever it takes for themselves, then it's fertile ground for unethical conduct. So that's the first lesson. You've got to create environments where people, feel that they're there to serve a higher purpose and not to behave in a very selfish, self-centered way.
So, and it's interesting in the work that I do on that in that context, Dennis, is that a lot of businesses have got to be they're in business for the sake of business rather than what the original purpose was for them existing in the first place. Or it might be the education sector that's there to really educate and do research, but actually what's happened is in some cases education is just the thing that the organisations do to make money, because the business purpose is really the purpose, not the other way around. And one of my executive coaching clients is a school principal, and he's very clear about using business principles to drive the purpose of education and community building. So he's very clear that the purpose hasn't changed, in fact, that education of the kids and community building is number one. He just uses business principles and strategies to get there, but he's not confused about the purpose, if that makes sense. And I would argue that therefore is an example of maintaining that context and keeping the purpose very clear. But I do think in a lot of cases the purpose has become confusing or confused for a lot of people, and as a result of that, they've really lost that big picture. And Daniel Pink's research, which you reference in your book too, highlights that purpose is one of the key factors for engagement, that people, human beings, all the research says, want to be connected with a higher purpose, irrespective of what our work is. So context shapes character is really important. And the second one you mentioned is that leaders shape the context. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that one, please?
Yeah, so ultimately, I like this terminology that a guy called Professor Robert Wood uses. He's the head of the Centre for Ethical Leadership, and he talks about personal integrity and systems integrity. And leaders, obviously, they need to have personal integrity. So if you've got a leader, who behaves in very unethical ways and behaves in ways that's at odds with the values of the organisation, then, you may as well pack up and go home. So, but even if you tick that box, let's just assume the leader has personal integrity, they can still preside over a system that doesn't have systems integrity, because they introduce reward systems that promote unethical behaviour. They turn a blind eye to poor conduct in the system and send a message that that's condoned and that's totally excusable. And sometimes they can do it in very subtle ways, Gary. I love the story of Bob Anderson, who was he used to be CEO of BHP in the late 1990s, and he was trying to turn around BHP's safety record at the time, because they were having a really poor run with their safety. And he was doing everything he could. He was communicating about it regularly. He had it written up in the company's charter. And then he brought his head of safety into his office and said, what's going on here? Why aren't the numbers going, the way they should be? And to his credit, the head of safety challenged him and said, it's your fault, Paul. And he said, what do you mean it's my fault? And the examples he used were the following. He said, well, everyone knows that you drive your Harley Davidson without a helmet. The speed limit in the car park's 5 kilometres per hour. Everyone knows your car and they know that you drive faster. Now, when you visit one of our sites, you don't follow the safety rules like wearing a helmet or holding onto the handrail. And all these little subtle things that the leader was doing was sending a really powerful message about what's really important and what you need to do to get ahead within the organisation. And it was shaping the context within which people were operating.
Yes, technically that's called espoused values versus values in action. And what Bob was doing, and he got called out. And in this case, it's a good example of the whistleblower, in this case being the head of safety guy, having the courage to do the truth to power to Bob and tell him, this is what I'm seeing and here's the evidence, and for Bob to actually be open to hearing that. So that's the powerful message, isn't it? Being open to hearing things that you might like to hear.
That is spot on, which is a great segue to our next point, Gary, which is dysfunctional group dynamics. And that's, ultimately what that comes down to is creating an environment, which is what you said, Gary, where people feel that they can speak openly, that they can challenge one another, that they can hold one another accountable, without being shut down or chastised. And you're spot on that example there with, I think it was, like I said, I might have said Bob Anderson, I think it was Paul Anderson, the CEO of BHP. It's spot on that not only was he receptive to what he heard, to the feedback, but he listened. And so often, Gary, we see, dysfunctional group dynamics usually exists because there's too much power. And people in leadership positions, fail to see how their power actually breeds silence and shuts down conversation. And so often, Gary, I'm sure we've all worked for leaders who say they run the so-called open door policy, but when you walk into that open door and deliver the bad news, it's one of the worst experiences, of your life. And leaders got to work hard at overcoming dysfunctional group dynamics and creating that environment where people feel empowered, that they can speak up, and when they speak up, they're listened to, they're respected, and their concerns are appropriately addressed.
Yes, Dennis, one of my coaching clients over time told me about his open door policy, and I said, so how many people come through that door? Oh, no one. I said, so what does that tell you about your open door policy? What does it tell me? I said, well, it's not really open. It's not really open. If the people have never actually come through it, it tells you that they don't actually trust what's going to happen when they come through it. And it was quite a shocking thing for him to hear. But he thought, he was following doing the right thing. But in reality, when someone did actually go through that door, what then happened was very inconsistent with the open door policy concept. And so people knew 100% what actually mattered and what didn't. So in terms of this dysfunctional group dynamics and dysfunctional leadership behaviours, you really highlight and spend a lot of time in your book explaining how these three factors of money, power and fear matter.
Yeah, I do, and more so in some industries than others. So particularly, obviously, I spend talking a bit about money because of what's happening in the banking and finance industry, Gary, and we all know, that a lot of the incentive structures in that industry are flawed and need to be addressed, but, we fail to recognise how, it's what you actually said before, Gary, how people lose sight of purpose in business because they start focusing, on the dollar. And we fail to recognise how a focus on money and money making can just debase our moral character and make us behave in very unethical ways. And then, I talk about power and how, when we take on positions, senior leadership positions, it can actually have an effect on how we behave, and that's, it's well documented in the research. But fear is important as well, and fear is an interesting one. Whenever you go through a period in your professional life when, your position becomes at risk, for a number of reasons, be it because, there's performance pressure and you're not performing, or there's a restructure, or, someone's trying to come after your role. That fear can actually cause you to behave in ways that, can be very uncharacteristic, and that can cause you to push ethical boundaries.
And just to be clear for the money one, folks, it's what the issue there is that in industries that are heavily weighted in providing bonuses for staff, what the research that Dennis has uncovered clearly identifies is those industries are seriously at risk of unethical behaviour creeping in over time. And there are many industries where that's the reality for that industry, where that's the way people are paid, but it sets up a structure, a systemic structure that makes things really, really challenging for people. And as a result of that, people just need to be aware of what are the structures that people are using. And again, in the book, Dennis refers to Daniel Pink and some of the research that the researchers in his space have uncovered, and really highlighting about ways that you can actually really look at your payment structures and how people are paid, particularly in those sorts of bonus style industries, and so that you're actually reducing the systemic structure that could very easily lead to the unethical behaviour. And the fear part and the power part, that again, there's a lot of research that Dennis has uncovered which really highlights just how challenging those aspects can be. Now, I'd like to just open up to see if we've got some questions that folk haven't had answered yet that you'd like us to answer for you. So please use your little chat functions. And Ellie says the smoke and mirrors accounting methods of bonus calculations. Yeah, the smokes and mirrors, absolutely, Ellie, that go on out there can be very considerable, and they can not particularly transparent. So are there any specific questions that you're very keen for Dennis to answer for you, folks, that we haven't answered yet? So I know
just on that, Gary, it's a good point actually on the that bonus structure, that we frown upon employees that might cook the books or missell a product to try and hit a target. But it's actually quite common in the business world that when they negotiate the target, people will sandbag, is the term they use, where they'll try and negotiate a target which is very favourable to them.
Yes.
And then if they hit the target, they basically put the feet up on the desk and don't try anymore, and try and reserve as much as they can for the year after. Now, you could say that these latter behaviours are just as unethical as the first, even though the first are explicitly unethical, people cooking the books or mis-selling. It's no different to a teacher who's rewarded on how well their students do on a test. If they went and changed the results of the test, that's clearly unethical. But what if they spent the whole year, instead of really enriching the student, just teaching to that test, so that they maximised, the mark? Shouldn't that be considered, as unethical as the prior? And this is where you've got to really think about these incentive schemes you set up, how they can drive that unwanted behaviour.
Now, Jean's interested to know that, going back to your experience again, that was there a time when you didn't feel confident enough? And just to reinforce, how did you overcome that?
Yeah, I think if you talk about why people don't speak up, two of the main reasons are fear and futility, essentially. So fear is that there's going to be consequences for you, and typically that happens when you're reporting to, like I said, a boss who's quite powerful and doesn't let people speak up. And futility is essentially that if you do speak up, you think nothing's going to happen anyway. And they were always the drivers, for me, for not doing anything. But like I said, once I had that moment where I opened up to that moral mentor, for want of a better term, it's almost like I went into autopilot, and it was just such a significant moment, Gary. I can't really explain it. It's almost like something clicked within me, and I just did what I had to do.
And look, it's interesting. It's unfolded into really, I suppose, your life's purpose and now your life's work. And Just as a point of disclosure, folks, Dennis and I have known each other since the 1990s, so since prior to all of this. And a number of years ago, we were chatting, and Dennis was talking about the fact that he was putting pen to paper and was doing some research as to how to go about doing that. And Dennis, to see the final product and to know the work that's gone into it, the extraordinary amount of hours, the sacrifice, the personal sacrifice that you've done to get your book out and published, and to really use this as a catalyst to get people talking about the subject. And I think one of the key lessons you really talk about for leaders is actually to be talking about ethics and to be having systemic structures in place where we're making decisions. And at one point in your book you explain an activity where literally prior to actually pressing the green button, we actually stop as a leadership team and say, righto, let's go forward 12 months and say, what if this has turned into an ethical disaster? How could that have occurred based on our decision right now? And actually go through that scenario and talk through it. And it's a very powerful exercise, and to get people talking about ethics and considering ethics in a much more open dialogue on a consistent basis is one of the key messages that you're really advocating.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the thing about ethics. We've tended to, we tend to put it with the moral philosophers and, sort of deep theoretical thought and all that sort of stuff. Actually, ethics in the real world is just messy, Gary, because it's people dealing with one another, values coming into conflict, and how you resolve that. And that's the only way you solve that is by having dialogue.
100%. Now, we have already hit our time, and time has absolutely flown by. I'd like to thank you again, for doing the work to produce, I think, this seminal book that you've produced for us, The Origins of Ethical Failures, the Lessons for Leaders. And again, I do encourage everyone to consider adding this to your bookshelf as one of the books that you turn yourself to, and get people talking about it. Get people talking about the reality of the challenge of ethics in the workplace, because at the end of the day, we were talking about millions of dollars before, and it just sounds like a bunch of numbers in relation to the FX trading scandal. But you know what? That was real people's money. Real people like everyone on this call right now, lost money, and in some cases lost their life savings as a result of that poor behaviour. And so there actually is a human and social impact. As Dennis said, people lost their jobs, and it doesn't have to be like that. The best security that we've all got is if we're actually doing the best we can, but behaving in an ethical manner and maintaining that focus on the greater good and the bigger purpose if we're trying to do. We've got folks for saying thank you. So Ellie's saying a big thank you to you. Catherine's saying thank you. I've found it really insightful and helpful. Again, we'd like to thank everyone in our audience, particularly for those of you who registered your questions for us prior to the webinar, because that enabled us to get some real focus for you and really specifically answer your questions and your needs. Thanks, says Jean. So once again, Dennis, would like to just thank you for your participation. For those of you that haven't connected with us yet, please feel free to connect with myself on LinkedIn, and Dennis you'll find very easily on LinkedIn as well. So once again, folks, this has been recorded, and we'll be sending out the link to the recording for you within the next 24 hours. So once again, thanks for your participation, and we look forward to working with you next time.